To all my friends out there, firstly, welcome. I hope you're safe, you're warm, and you're happy and healthy. And I think that's the first thing. And you know, if you step back and think that if 6 months ago, uh, let's say a Hollywood producer received a script, and that script said that, you know, the world is going to be hit by a virus, a global virus, which will completely stop the world and completely paralyze the world, and everything will come to a complete standstill. And we will be in a complete lockdown, and then we'll find a way out of that. That script would potentially be thrown out by the producer, saying completely unrealistic, won't happen, and it's not going to be. And therefore, what ends up tend to happening is that we are living in what I would call unprecedented times, and times that we haven't even thought of. So because we have an exponential crisis, which we do, an exponential paralysis that we have, at this point in time, we need an exponential response. So one of the key things that I talk about is that as we go out in the world, if we look and say, well, another 3 months will go by, and then we'll continue on the same trajectory, and we'll find a way, and we'll work a bit harder, and we'll work a bit differently, we'll be fine. My thesis is that that's not going to happen. We now need to be looking at a completely different scenario. And the metaphor that I use regularly, and that's the metaphor of a caterpillar to a butterfly. That a caterpillar is sort of eating away, and at one point in time, it has to make a decision that it just keeps on eating and doing exactly the same thing and hoping it'll be fine. Or it makes a very big, bold decision to go into its pupa, into its chrysalis, builds it around itself. And when it's in there, it completely liquidizes itself. It completely makes itself and changes form, and then comes out as this beautiful, vibrant, colorful, blazing butterfly. So what the caterpillar had to do is to have the courage to change its form, to create a new form. And that is part of the metamorphosis that we'll talk about today, Mark, is exactly how do we actually see some of that. And I think it's really quite important that we address some of that. The next is, I'd like to also talk about the fact that the world is becoming totally interdependent. And in this interdependent environment, what we are looking at, and that is the nature of today's conversation, and in this interdependence, we're looking at how all of these things, globalization and deglobalization, is coming together. And I'd like to throw in 3 phrases earlier on, and we'll go back into a discussion on this. And my first word is, one of the critical drivers for the future is trust. And how we build trust networks, trust connections, and build a whole ecosystem of trust in a new way that we haven't done before. And the second item is on what we call social capital, which is connectedness, harmony within the society, a sense of belonging and connection, and sense of engagement with society that the governments are doing with their companies. And the third one is collective intelligence and collective consciousness. And this collective intelligence and consciousness is fighting the common enemy, the one single enemy. For the very first time in history, we have one enemy, and everybody's fighting it. The epidemiologists, the scientists, the technologists, people like you and I, every single person is working to focus on one enemy. So we shall prevail. We will go forward in this particular environment. So these are just some of the things I wanted to mention and look at our new leadership and what kind of decisions are our leaders making at this point in time, because we are making decisions through anxiety, confusion, and ambiguity. Those are our new leaders, and therefore we have to completely change our perspective and then take it on from there. So these are just some of the key elements that I wanted to throw out there, and now open it up to you, Mark, in this new COVID reset. And I actually use the word reset, and I you know, when we discussed this whole topic, we both addressed this, is that it is a reset, and metamorphosis to me was just one symbolic, metaphoric way of explaining it. So when I say the word reset, the COVID reset, Mark, in your words, firstly, welcome, but in your words, what do you feel that reset is about?
Mm. So Tariq, first of all, thanks for making this happen, the arrangement, the fact that you work with me in creating the space for this webinar. And the space is ahead of us that we want to create together. I think that, like you, I tend to see that this is quite an unmatched period of history, because I think a concurrence of a number of different factors are happening at the same time. So history helped us to understand what we did back in time, what we're facing with adversities, but we have never seen the magnitude and scale of adversity like we see now. But as you were saying before, we have never been really confronted with exponential risk. We've always been confronted with some form of control risk that were somehow bound by or bounded by a specific region. We always had financial crisis that used to be regional crisis. Sometimes it was spilling over to be more international crisis, but we have never seen anything like this. Now, I'm also aware that when we were back in 1918, 1920 during the Spanish flu, which was the only period of time where we have documented a pandemic, one of the greatest period of growth and prosperity happened right after that. You know, yes, we were somehow hit in 1929 with the Great Depression, then we went into a Second World War. But it has to be said that the Spanish flu was somehow a reset button to push society into a different form of evolution. And I think this is really where I think the reset is. We forget that both society and the economy are entropic, so they're constantly evolving. We have been spoiled to think about the economy and society as some form of geometric shape that keeps its boundary. But we keep on forgetting that by the nature of how we are, any form of biological system somehow is constantly pushing into some form of evolution. So I see this metamorphosis of a form of evolution. And the reason why we are evolving is because the system that we have left behind was ill-conceived, and it was actually a quite terminal ill patient. So we always have to make a connection between what is the pandemic, which is of course its own specific circumstances, but why has the pandemic hit us so much? It's not because of the pandemic itself, it's because of the relatively weak foundation we used to have before the pandemic. So it's the pre-context that I think is important to discuss.
Yeah, but you talk about the Spanish flu, and I want to build that as part of our context. Do you know that 50 million people died during the Spanish flu? And it hit up to 500 million people, which at that time was almost 1/3 of the world's population. So it is very dramatic. Unfortunately, we are not that deep in it yet. And I dare say, I hope that we'll never get there. I think we have enough technology and enough focus to ensure that we'll never get to any of those proportions. Mm-hmm. But beyond that, we had the Second World War, another reset. Mm-hmm. 1987, another reset. The dot-com crash, another reset. 9/11, another reset. 2008 and 9. And I'd like to build those resets and just put some context around those markets. Yes. Post 9/11, post Second World War, we had the Bretton Woods session. Convention, and basically at that time they sort of said, well, we have to have a new world. So IMF, United Nations, World Bank, the UN Security Council, all of these came out at that point in time. Yeah. And what I would like to ask you is that in that reset, yes, it served us for about 75, 80 years, but are those institutions still valid for the next 70, 80 years? Or do we need to fundamentally change and shift them into the future? And I'll have a follow-on question after that. So do you think those institutions are valid now?
So Tariq, I think that they are inevitably valid in the sense that we still need to have multilateral organizations, especially when we're dealing with global issues. The institution as they were did not get weak because of pandemic. They got weak because of the rise of nationalism, and predominantly with the Trump administrations. Those institutions, they start to suffer the lack of trust of what is somehow a significant economy like the US one. So the issue with those institutions happened before the pandemic. The pandemic has simply accelerated their obsolescence somehow, but equally their need for all of us to have multilateral institutions when we're dealing with problems that we have in common, like you share at the beginning of our session. So I believe their mandate will change. Their degree of agility will need to be much more proportional to the kind of problems we're facing. I don't know whether they will be the same or they will actually metamorph into something else. But I still think that if there is one thing that will become even more fortified after this, is the need for us to have this level of intergovernmental agencies, because the face of the problems we're going to face in the years to come, they're not going to be nationalistic problems. They're going to be mainly global challenges. And so we need to think that while there is the rise of, as we will mention today, some form of localism. Localism is mainly the governance on the ground, but it doesn't change that some of these challenges will happen across the world and with asymmetrical impact, but still they will happen.
So I'll challenge you on that a little bit, because I think we should be looking at different kinds of institutions, because Mark, both you and I work in organizations where we're looking at transformation, and creativity and innovation tends very seldom to come from within the organization, and the adjustments and the immune systems are too strong to change. So it comes from the edges and from the outside, and then it starts getting into the center. So expecting them to change is highly unlikely to happen. There will be marginal changes. What we need is fundamental changes. So a new reset for me would be a global institution for the future of work, a global institution for the health of the planet, a global institution for new forms of learning and development, a new form of health. World Health Organization, is it addressing the needs of the future? Or are they looking at mostly sick care rather than preventive and predictive care? And finally, governance tools on AI, on ethics, on trust, on how to look at robotics and stuff like that. So my reset, for me, institutional reset is, let's throw out all these old institutions, at least just keep some of the basic core that is already there, but start building on these as global platforms on trust and social capital and collective intelligence and collective consciousness and technology. Shouldn't that be an institutional reset?
So it should, Tariq. The question is, where will this institution be erected? Because it was quite easy for many of us to have the US taking that role in the past. You know, it was easy that the 1944 conference, as you mentioned, happened. Then the US became the hegemon of the New World Order. I think if this crisis has proved something to us, is that we are into a massive leadership vacuum in which we have small leaders and big problems. And I guess the best leaders are coming from relatively small countries. Golden standard in how countries have been managing the pandemic are mainly in Asia. But many of the countries that have really done a phenomenal job, like Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, New Zealand, they're countries that tends to be small in terms of size in comparison to the largest one. So I think the question is, where will this institution eventually rise, and who will become the placeholder for this? I would imagine that some of those institutions that were historical eventually will downsize some of their original functions, but you know, they still have a lot of vested political power. So I think the question that I think you're bringing up is, where will the epicenter really shift, where we might think about sparkling this across multiple form of institutional surges. But I would hope there's a form of reset that we'll see, because some of the topics you're mentioning are topics that are needed, but they're quite underserved right now.
You're right about some of the smaller countries doing very well, and 7 of those countries, New Zealand, Germany, and various other countries, Iceland, and so on, they were all women. And some of the best response came from countries led by women. So they were using compassion and empathy and competence. And that, to me, becomes the new leadership requirement, is none of the command and control structure, but more a collaborative, compassion and humanity-driven structure, which women are naturally leading, and some other countries, obviously in South Korea and other places, have done really well, in Singapore and so on. So that's one of the new leadership things that we might be looking at and discuss in more depth. But you mentioned something in there. Do you think the world is now, in the lack of leadership, it's tilting towards Asia in terms of showing future leadership?
So if in a different webinar, we were building some scenarios, and one of the scenarios that was somehow proposed was, who are the winners, who are the losers in this current global crisis? And clearly, the more technocratic economies out of Asia have demonstrated a significant advantage, if not dominance, in dealing with this. It's not just because of their government structure, because you can say that some of the country that did very well are democracies, some of the country are not. So we didn't find any evidence that just because there's more obedience, suddenly the outcome is different because of the relationship with the government structure. So I think clearly Asia was, even before, shifting to be the epicenter for a number of different indicators. China, as the largest economy within that group, has always become a much more significant point of gravitation than what it used to be back in time. And I guess going back to the conversation before, when you're having a much more inward-looking US, you clearly are generating some form of gap in the global leadership space. So I think we have a simultaneous phenomenon of decrease of influence of the old system. And also, if you're looking at the number of people that got infected, 2/3 are mainly Western Europe and US. Yeah. So clearly, right, there's something that we need to reflect there. And Asia, I think, has become now de facto the new point of reference. What I don't see yet is a clear intention to claim that role of global leader, but de facto it is.
So let's look at some of the supply chains and how the whole world is interdependent and connected. Suddenly a lot of countries, and 80% of the Fortune 500 companies, just woke up and said, whoops, a lot of all our production is out of China. And suddenly that became an interdependence issue, which was never there before. So now everything was concentrated in China. The supply chains broke down. Now, what do you think will be the new supply chains? And are we looking at Vietnam, India, maybe Nigeria, maybe Mexico and Brazil? Are we looking at a redistribution of the production as we go forward and redefinition of the supply chains? Or do you think that this will just recover and get back close to where we were before? Because we were driven by profit and the cheapest thing available, as opposed to other variables.
So I would say, though, Tariq, that's an interesting question. There is actually evidence of both. So I'm talking about pre-coronavirus. We have evidence of largely horizontally distributed supply chains where now we were producing things all over the world, and we were using the sophisticated logistic platform and mobility to manually assemble things. And that's one side of the story where China has a predominant role. We can say that China is roughly always responsible for about 70% of the procurement in distributed supply chains. The other evidence is that as I mentioned before, more nationalist leaders have emerged on the horizon a few years back. We now count about 25 global leaders who've been elected on populist movements. Some of that production started to be more localized. And to go back into strategic terms, we went from distributed to more vertical. One quick example, something that I discovered recently, Tesla is almost entirely fully vertically integrated and just produced in the US, as an example. So there are a number of cases where we see company that, because of, I think, also the increasing labor costs that we had in the traditional country like China and Southeast Asia and now India, they were already resorting through technology and automation, but vertically producing inside. So I think we had evidence of both, Tariq, that we had a fully globalized supply chain, but we equally had example of pockets that were starting to localize. So I believe that this hybrid model will continue somehow. I also feel optimistic that we will have some bounce back because some of these companies are primarily logistics companies that distribute around the world. Standards of living and consumer are getting more and more sophisticated around the world. So I think we're going to have some form of bouncing back in some capacity, and there will be other example where some industry that got really hit really hard, they will decide at first to reduce their cost by localizing, investing in technology, but that has then a social component about what will happen to employment in those regions. Yeah. Finally, on your point, Tariq, I guess governments in this crisis realize that interdependency should never be over dependency. And I think we started to feel that with the provision of, for example, medical supply, if too much of that came only from one country, that becomes something that collides with national interest. And so maybe what we can acknowledge is that government will try to incentivize funds and investment to the local production of some critical supplies.
So we've discussed a little bit about systemic risks that were there. We've discussed a little bit about the nationalism and the interdependence on the supply chain. Let's take a couple of industries as we go forward. And I think it would be, what in your opinion are the industries that are most ready and most ripe for change right now, post-COVID? Which are the ones which are, I wouldn't say vulnerable, but ready for change?
So the ones that are ready for change are the ones that were already pivoting some form of hybridized models, primarily in the work in labor. There were companies that were trying to maybe have a day a week of telework, maybe two, or people that were starting to work with freelancers on a more regular basis. So those companies, so not necessarily industry-wise, but I'm talking about the typology of company as they were run internally. Those companies that were pivoting before, they suddenly had accelerated experimentation cycle as if they went into a super chamber and suddenly they go in 30 days into what would have happened in 3, 4, 5 years. You know, the COVID-19 has been one of the most significant accelerants that we have ever seen for companies that were pivoting. The companies that were not survive are the companies that were not experimenting before, and they were hoping that everything will be always okay. And that's quite naive to believe that. But equally, they were the company that were confident enough that having 2 weeks of cash flow would always be enough. So I think their financial management is what will actually make them render them insolvent or eventually filing for bankruptcy. So again, maybe I'm a little bit insensitive here, but I think COVID-19 is punishing those enterprises that were not thinking about the future in the same way as other companies were. I still think that what we should protect is employability because many people were dependent on those jobs. But I do believe that what the COVID-19 has done is created almost like a leapfrog for those companies that will manage risks differently because they have introduced a future-proof way of thinking in the way they actually operate.
Which nicely segues me into talking about anti-fragility. And Nassim Taleb's books Black Swan and then on anti-fragility, where it talks about the fragile companies when they were hit by this meteor that came at us. I mean, they are really struggling. That may be 20, 25%. Then the resilient, robust companies, and I would dare say 30, 40, 50% of the companies will find a way there. But the third area are the anti-fragile companies, which he describes as those companies that thrive on disorder and thrive on this change and will be able to pivot and come out. And my question back to you again is, I can identify 3, 4, 5 industries that will fundamentally pivot into the future and will be very anti-fragile. I just wanted to get your thoughts first and then I'll comment.
Right. So I think, well, first of all, any form of a platform or aggregator will of course thrive. That's because they were thriving before, but they simply didn't have the accelerant. Now they became normalized in many practices we have. Education or the larger sphere of knowledge or content that is generated through knowledge, I think has discovered that you can migrate your capacity to a different delivery. It does not necessarily change the delivery itself. What changes is the fact the experience has to be virtual. There are a number of different events and summits that used to be in physical location and now they shifted into virtual summits, and they did it in a relatively short period of time. So these are some industries that I think they have thrived a lot because they were able to, as you said before, experiment in the middle of the crisis where most people were into denial. There are many companies that maybe were never thinking about the technology solutions that are required to do this, not because the technology is expensive, because some of these solutions are open innovation, but because they were never digitalized before. So their cultural gap was too big for them to overcome the shock.
I agree with education, but part of my thesis is that the great institutions of the world will probably remain fairly strong, and all of the changes will come from the edges, because that is where all the differences are going to be, and all the innovation is going to come. I was doing a webinar yesterday with 82 students with Harvard Business School, and it was quite interesting. They were from 40 countries, from all over the world, and we discussed this, that 80% plus of all information and education that is available out there is free of charge. I have received 178 books that have been written in the COVID-19 environment free of charge. So there's a lot of information, and I think it'll come from the edges, while perhaps some of the institutions will remain.
Yeah.
Now, moving forward, I think one of the biggest industries, and probably the biggest industry for change, is going to be the healthcare sector. And as Tim Cook with Apple, when he said about 6 months ago, maybe he was prophetic, he said that Apple will be remembered in the future for its contribution to healthcare by 2030, rather than to its basic technology at this moment in time, because they have access to data and products and so on. My thesis is that 2030 has just been pulled back, or pulled forward rather, to 2023. In other words, they'll just focus all of their time and attention, and then they'll end up changing and moving the model from sick care to healthcare, to going into preventive and predictive. Don't you think that is probably a $4 trillion industry that can absolutely explode and change the world?
I think so. I mean, I guess what we have all learned is that the rationale around healthcare, number of beds in hospital, ICU, and ventilators versus the population is a quite old-fashioned story, because it was designed when we were using a linear distribution of what is the incidence of people getting sick, and that's how we should actually design hospitals. So I think it will be a redesign of what is a hospital. I mean, looking at the example that China was able to build 2 hospitals within few hours, right? So to the idea that hospital might not necessarily be just for the intensive care, because one of the things that characterized how China was able to get out of the peak was to treat mild patients, those that mainly will not necessarily need to go into ICUs. The fact that we have the ability to utilize cross-governmental or cross-country resources and the mobility around that. So I think healthcare, but also the infrastructure around healthcare, are equally going to be hopefully overinvested. And again, we knew that there was a chance, especially after Ebola, that we could have faced an airborne virus. This was not actually, in fact, this is not a black swan. This is, if we have to use the analogy of the animal, it's at least a white swan, if not a gray rhino, right? So it's not something that suddenly we did not expect. I mean, nobody came from Mars to tell you we got COVID-19, right? So I guess we are facing now, I think, the shock of a system that was not ready to deal with the degree of complexity. But I'm hoping, Rhetoric, that how we will eventually recover will be by investing into healthcare in a way we have not done before, because probably we didn't have the pain points. I guess now everybody has the pain point.
There was an interesting survey that was done about a couple of weeks ago. This was at the EXO World Summit, and it was done by Peter Diamandis. And the question he asked is, all of the people around it, and it went to about 5,000 people. And the question was, which company would be an integral part of our home health and our private and personal health, and which company is going to lead in the future in the next 5 years? And the options that were given was company you've never heard of, Apple, Amazon, the government, and the existing pharma. So these are the 5 options. Which one do you think won?
I have to choose one.
Yes.
Well,
and it won handsomely.
Okay, so listen, but my answer is mutually inclusive, which means that, of course, the other 4 equally matters. Okay. I would like to think about the ones that don't exist yet, simply because we have seen significant company rising from previous crises that became new unicorns, so to say. So I would like, and that's also a message for all those innovators that currently are maybe watching us. that
Yep.
really there is need for that kind of innovation to now play a much larger scale of the economy, which is not just what is the traditional idea of innovation, but it's really the fact that we need to have actionable solution now. So I would basically place my bet on the new ones.
You place your bet absolutely correctly. That's why you're the professor at Harvard, Cambridge, Hull, Thunderbird. You've got the finger on the pulse, and that is exactly, that was number one. And the number two was not surprising, but interestingly, it was Amazon. And because of the platform and the ability that they can transact, so they can go into anything that they would like to do, and they are a data-driven company on a platform that can do transactions, while Apple is much more of a product company. So Amazon was a close second, and existing pharma got about 3 to 4% of the total number. Shame on them.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
that's what I would say.
Absolutely.
So anyway, and the government got a little bit more, but the existing pharma was number 5 out of 5. So that really shows where the world is and where the current pharma is, and we need to build. Obviously, they don't have they have a vested interest for things to remain the same, and therefore it's very difficult to change from within. Another one which I'd like to share, and it is in our lifetime, basically 1987 and post-1987 crash, we had some amazing companies, the Googles and the Oracles and the Microsofts of the world taking off. Then we had the dot-com crash and so on. At that point in time, a few things were changing. And then followed that with Facebook and all of this next generation system. But to me, the time was 2008-9 when 3G became available properly. And that's when a lot of our world changed. And that was the beginning of when the iPhone came out. Because Steve Jobs was trying to exchange videos and photos and so on, and 3G made it possible for that to actually happen. And effectively, that changed the world, and Samsung and Android followed. So at every single wave, the underlying high-quality companies that were laying the pipes and putting the masts and so on were really building the infrastructure to build the future. Now we are building that infrastructure for 5G, and my thesis is that 5G will fundamentally change the game for us all over again. What are your thoughts from the telecom sector, both long-term, what needs to happen, and what can 5G and technology related to it do to fundamentally change all our businesses?
So, it's really interesting. 5G is one of the core strategies for China. So it's one of the top priorities they have, which goes back to some of the conversations we were having before. Where are the outlining winners coming from? And I think that provides us at least with a inkling of where some of the winners can come from. I think telco will change because we have all experienced higher dependency from that form of connection that we have always experienced, but now we went to the next level. And that's probably where we're going to be able to subsidize some of the losses that might come from the fact that some part of the production will become more localized. That's also why I have always been trying to bring this tension between local and virtual, which has somehow given a spin also to our preparation of the webinar. So I think that's where telco will play a major role in creating that form of arteries that would create the access to the global economy, but maybe slightly denormalized from what used to be before. And again, I don't think that we will lose the mobility to the point in which we won't travel anymore, we won't have events anymore. But I think what we have created now, we have expanded the pie. It's not that we're replacing the pie. And this is something that tends to be somehow, when you're reading people that bring very doom scenarios, I always find them somehow limited in their thinking because they don't understand that the world doesn't work in binary structures anymore. So I don't think we're going to replace what we used to do with something else. We're going to expand it. So in the future, there will be mobility, there will be localism, and there will be also the chance to use telco to bridge gap, to actually close gaps and building bridges that we haven't done before. So I see this as a creative value sort of like industry, both in the short and in the long term. But I don't know whether it will be still a relatively close group of company like the oligopoly that some telco has been, or whether it will be more about the hybrid in which the internet company, like the company that have somehow disrupted the industry in the first place, will alternate themselves with the traditional tycoons. So, but that I think is going to be a critical industry.
It is, but I was going beyond that. But the facility and the capability of 5G will help with telemedicine. So the health industry will change, will help with education. So that industry will change. Our industry to be able to speak publicly will change. Health travel will change because we don't need to travel so much. So you will be here as an avatar rather than anything else in 1 year's time. So all of those things will start changing because, again, I'll go back to where I started about building trust and connectivity at a global level. Now, we've spoken about deglobalization, but we need to, at some point in time, find a way to trust each other and find ambient trust and build trust networks and models. For example, how can we travel in the future if there is no trust between countries, between governments, between airlines? I mean, you would not want a plane to come in which is not safe into your country. So we will have a chip or a wearable or health passports or something like that, but we build that. Now, as we are building those global networks, Mark, my whole thing is, I think 3G, layered with all of the other technologies and stuff, 5G, with all the other technologies that are there, will enable us to fundamentally transform the world into a bigger pie that you just rightly mentioned. So that was, just sort of my analysis of what I've also found. One more topic. One more big topic, and then we'll go into a Q&A and look at some of the remarks that we have. And that's energy. Looking at energy for the first time in my life, last week, when I was seeing negative around the West Texas intermediate oil price in the US at minus $37, minus 37. In other words, they were paying you $37 to take the barrel of oil away from them for the May futures contract. Now, demand died, and it died to that extent, but there must be some systemic issues within the industry and the way it's structured. Otherwise, how can that happen?
Yeah. So, Tariq, I think the systemic issues that we have been overproducing for too long. And that's because, again, I think it's the obsolescence of a model that did not really understand the world has changed, even before the pandemic. In most metropolis around the world, the millennial and the Generation X are not driving as I used to drive when I mainly got my license. There is a different shift of what is actually the sense of ownership, and we all know this through the sharing economy. But also, we are somehow having large amount of investment going into renewables because, with the exception of very few countries, even before this crash, very few countries were making money out of extracting oil. So somehow, if before was, let's say, a party attended by many people, and now it became a party attended by few. So I think multiple reasons are to be comprised into the shock of the oil industry. And some of this acceleration is going towards solar. Some of this is going into alternative form of energies. Some of this is going into some form of frugal energy, even in rich countries, where we are coming up with ingenious ideas on how to power our vehicles. So I think a combination of jugaad and frugal innovation on one side, changes in consumer behaviors, the fact that we have overproduced and the overproduced was somehow being hit by an under demand. All of this created, and also the geopolitics around this, created, I think, a systemic shock. And also the fact that oil for many countries was a strategic asset, but countries were not able to diversify fast enough. And so if you don't diversify, somehow you're becoming fragile. If you're becoming fragile, as soon as there is a shock, you can't gain from it. And so you fracture.
Yeah, I mean, I look at that's as part of that systemic problem, even in the financial markets. We have $250 trillion worth of debt out there versus an $85 trillion global economy. So we are living on a credit card, basically.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing. And when the market volatility was hitting the United States, when the COVID crisis was biting initially, the fundamental systemic problems there was that the market had too much commercial debt in there. The whole environment was just heavy. So the moment the price or the shock happened, it was already there. And as now with the low oil price, you'll have 300, 400, 500 oil companies disappearing because they're just not going to be able to cope. So that whole industry is changing. I'm very hopeful in terms of solar energy, because solar energy is down to about 1 cent per kilowatt hour, and potentially it's going to become almost free. So if free energy is available, then what does that create? A whole new environment. It's a little bit like the internet. Free internet, so free communication. Now, free energy. Therefore, free desalination, therefore more food, etc. So we can talk about that. Let's talk a little bit about some of the ethical and social issues, because now 5G is there, global positioning is there, all of these type of things. And that was one of the questions that came through, is how do you see us, and this is going back to the institutions question, how do you see us addressing the issues of ethics? You're an AI expert, you wrote a great book on AI, AI Republic. What do you think, how do you manage the ethics there?
So, Tariq, that's where I cannot be optimistic yet, because I think if we have now evidence that the last few decades have created even more disparity and more interest for the few than for the larger masses. And again, there is a two-speed conversation. Yes, a lot of improvement have lifted millions of people out of poverty, getting them access to the global economy. But the system was designed for mainly the maximization of value for very few. Even the way in which speculation happened in the financial market was always looking at the shareholders rather than anybody else. And I think that is something that has, first of all, failed the original model of capitalism, because that's not what capitalism was supposed to be. And second, I think we are learning that capitalism was a great way for us to govern ourselves from an economic perspective, but it has become insufficient for the kind of needs we have. So I'm not saying that it's a bad system, I'm saying it has become fatigue and it needs to be somehow refreshed and modernized. And that is where I think the ethical conversation needs to be put place, because we cannot have a system that is inherently working for a few, because otherwise social unrest rises and social injustice. And when those people are disenfranchised, they are prone to become radicalized. And when they radicalize, even a really poor rhetoric is good enough to get a political support. So I think the ethics of the future should be somehow thinking of inclusion, of inclusive society more than before, because there is no trade-off between prosperity and inclusion. I don't know where someone came up with the idea that there is a trade-off, but there isn't. And I think that's where also the conversation of building trust needs to actually be placed, is that trust needs to be that in the collective ability for us to create value, we all win.
Absolutely. And I think some of these social and cultural shifts that are going to happen, I think is going to create a new equilibrium, a new balance. People talk about going back to normal. I'd say normal is gone, it's history.
Yeah.
Going back to the future normal. And I'm just saying the future normal is a new equilibrium of some kind. What's the kind of equilibrium do you see? Do you see a renaissance like the 15th, 16th century? Or where do you see us in terms of, after all this is over, where do we settle?
So I tend to agree with you that normal as before is gone because he was a terminal ill patient and he has simply gone. Not because COVID is the real problem. The problem was what we had before. So I'm actually happy it's gone somehow because it was not sustainable anyway. I think the new equilibrium will be a little bit of pain to endure in the short term for many of us because the system is readjusting. But if the right conversation are made, if the right sort of inspiration is created, if the right level of leadership is actually put in place, I think we will come out of this much more resilient. To use a term that has been overused these days, but I mean it's the best way to describe what I think will happen. Resilience is the kind of society we want to have because resilience is a component that can give us anti-fragility. I don't think we're going to become anti-fragile at first, but I'm hoping that we're going to become resilient. So mainly designed to endure shocks rather than designed to actually suffer under shocks.
Mark, you're a global thinker, you're an author, you're an entrepreneur, you're a professor at multiple universities. So all of these amazing credentials. Now we've got a plethora of questions coming through. So may I request, I'll go through a series of questions with short, sharp answers so that we are able to address a lot of points. So one of them was, I was wondering about the process of deglobalization and thinking that a multipolar system of IR might reinforce even more. What do you think about that?
I think so. I mean, I guess there is a chance that we will have permanent asymmetries. around the world. You know, I think is a panacea to think that we will all get to the same form of globalized society. And there is okay, you know, there is beauty also in diversity. I think what matters not the asymmetry is the ability for every single space or ecosystem to be able to generate value, and but creating mobility for people to match their life with their ambitions as well.
Okay. Another question was, can we ethically transform the world using the 5G and so on? Is there a serious risk of threat for public health? And this brings us to another point in terms of total surveillance, which we can accept during a pandemic, but then what about our citizens' rights in the future? I think that's one of the key challenges.
You know, we're having a conversation yesterday with the guy who actually discovered that COVID-19 was becoming a pandemic before anybody else. Is a researcher out of California, and his work is now read by millions. You know, he said to me something very interesting. He said, we have no hesitation to give consent for our information when we're merely looking for a travel, a restaurant, or when we sign up for a digital service. But we tend to be freaked out if somebody will trace our mobile phones in case, you know, we are infected. And he was saying something very true. The moment you're infected, your rights are suspended because suddenly you become an hazard for public health. So somehow I wonder why we are using two different measures for the same problems. I think we have to start reconciling the idea that we have lost some of our privacy already. At least in this case, it will be for a purpose.
Another question, which is quite interesting and a big question, and he said, do we now need another ism? Capitalism, communism, all of those things have now happened, and are they serving us? Is there a new ism that we're looking at? Are we looking at futurism, perhaps?
Yeah.
Or humanism? I'm thinking off the top of my head of humanism.
Yes.
And rebuild ourselves from a different place.
I don't know, because I think it's a question that is difficult for me to determine just as an answer. I think that whatever ism it will be a real reset from what we had before. Because I think every single form of ism as exhausted dysfunction, even if we're going to use same system as we used before, it will never look the same, because it will have to be dealing with the external party that now are part of any form of ecosystem. So even if it's capitalism, it would be capitalism 3.0, 4.0, whatever it is, but it would be very different from what I would hope it would be very different from what we had before.
Yeah. Somebody suggested that what about a big fat world war between US and China, and that'll sort out quite a few problems and kill a few hundreds of millions of people, and we're back again. A dire scenario. But I guess it's a valid question.
It is. I don't think that this is going to lead to conflict, because again, we are no longer on our own. You know, the idea of a country today is very different from what it used when we came up with picking up fights. And although nationalism is becoming relevant, it's not yet the predominant force in any given country. It's enough to maybe win an election, but it's not enough to define an ideology. So I don't think so. I think we're far from that. And I'm hoping that it will be the opposite. It will be the age of the greatest collaboration.
I would hope so. We've got about 6 minutes to go, Mark. So I think we'll start asking some interesting related questions, but with quick answers. What about talent? I mean, is the new global economy a talent economy, using technology and so on to connect with each other rather than just moving goods and services?
100%. And I think the war for talent is the only war we'll actually fight, more now than ever before.
What about things, other things that you'd like to look at in terms of behavioral change, social changes and stuff? What would you recommend in terms of our new way of living?
See, I think we have been underplaying the psychological impact of COVID-19, because we always talk about, on one side, lockdown, the other side, reopening the economy, but we hardly see how this changed us. And I would love to see more work in the way in which this chamber, this somehow accelerant chamber, changed the way we are.
My trusted dear colleague, Paul Epping, asked me this question earlier. I didn't see it here. And that was that with 5G, with Wi-Fi everywhere, with working at home and so on, the new way could be not urbanization, but de-urbanization, because you can be anywhere you like and work in your pajamas and do whatever and be just as effective. Do you think that the whole mega trend of urbanization will be slowing down or shifting to de-urbanization?
Yes and no. I think in the West we will, because we no longer will need to think of the downtown, the city center, the city as a way of us to work. In the emerging economy like China, India, Nigeria, it's the opposite. They will urbanize at an even faster pace. So we're going to have two polarity in this.
Okay. What people are asking are the kinds of skills and attributes that you now need to address the future, and what are the new tool sets that we need to apply?
I think measuring models exponentially and being able to work with exponential information and be able to come up with framework out of that assumption is where I think a lot of people working in analytics or in management or in business, they really need to actually learn how to do this, because we will keep on having wicked problems that will not be able to be addressed by the old frameworks.
I think that some of the softer skills like empathy and emotion and compassion and creativity and imagination, because I think a lot of these things won't go to computers, will stay with us. So anthropologists and musicians and artists and nurses and counselors, these will be the jobs of the future in many ways. Would you agree?
I agree with you, Rhetoric, 100%. I think compassion is going to be the next competitive advantage in many ways.
What are the big tool sets now? Because let's just look at a couple of real questions. What can people do, one, for the next 3 months while we're getting out of this? And how do they build their resilience and robustness and anti-fragility in this few months that we are in lockdown?
I think the first one is really to embrace and accept that the shock happens. Like when you crash a car, you can't not accept that the car is being crashed, right? So I think the acceptance is the first one. The second one is, what can you do with what you have right now? I always believe in the power of now, and I don't like procrastinators, right? I think there's a lot of power we can do right now in adjusting our business model. The reason why we don't do it is because we are not accepting that the world has changed.
Mark, I'm totally conscious that you have a hard stop at 4 o'clock.
Yes.
So folks, I will continue for the next 10, 15 minutes with Q&A because there are a lot of questions there and there are many hands raised that I would like to address. So as we move out, and Mark has been very kind to agree in principle that we should do this once a month, and it'll be towards the end of May and then the end of June. Really to do some kind of a catch up on what happened in the last 30 days, because now we're not living in months, we're living in days and weeks, and literally things are changing. So 4 weeks from now is probably like 4 months from now in the old world. So as we exit this session, Mark, in the next 1 to 2 minutes, can you give us a message of hope, a message of optimism? I mean, I'm not feeding you. I mean, do you believe there is hope and optimism?
I think so, Rick. I mean, I think that we are designed for undergoing shocks, because it's without stressor we would not even walk. It's because of stress and shock that our bones are strong enough to walk and defeat some form of gravity, right? So I think we are designed for that level of resilience. We have been, though, somehow tamed and domesticated not to be resilient, because it's easier to control, because when you break, you can maybe sell the service of recovery, right? I think we will learn to be different. We will start understanding social dynamics and social ties differently. We'll use soft skills that we mentioned as a way for us to define value rather than just financial. We'll expand from the narrow economic terms. I see this to be probably what we really needed. It's like when you have a good prep talk with a good friend that suddenly tell you very many things back in time was not working. And you heard it over and over again, but it's only one moment you wake up and you realize that the world that you used to live in has gone. And what is ahead of you is the only place where you can be, so clearly.
Yeah, and on that positive note, I would say that, what are the things we need to do more of, and what are the things we shouldn't do and leave them behind us and live a new world. Mark, we are extremely grateful. You've been generous with your time. You've been open. We are friends, so we can connect and trust. how to develop this. And these talks are really important because we are testing new things and testing new ideas. And there are three pandemics going on: the pandemic of the virus, but the pandemic of isolation and despair, and the pandemic of fear. And those need to be addressed. But the last one is that in our fight or flight survival mechanism, we are also taking in too much information and a lot of disinformation and misinformation. And my final message before Mark leaves is to sort of find a way that we should be discerning and careful in terms of the quality of the webinars and the quality of the work, because now the webinar business has become an ocean. We now need to select and pull out the ones that are authentic, meaningful, genuine, and there for a purpose to contribute to society in this particular way. So Mark, thank you for your contribution, and thank you for all the people who attended. And
thanks for everyone who joined today. I mean, it was great to see also many familiar names, and that is particularly important to me to see that you keep on following with the work that is happening around my commitment to make this a better place. And I'll see, if you wish, in a month in the same space with Tariq, where we're going to go even deeper and have more conversation. All the best. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Ciao.
Thanks. Cheers. Bye. And so folks, you're left with me. I'm obviously going to do the best I can with the answers and understanding that I have. Questions, folks, are, why do you hope to change capitalism? So, interesting question, because it's not working. Because it's become a feudalistic society where you have the feudals and the serfs. So guess what? The top 5 companies in the world have a greater valuation than all of the tech companies in the world put together. That's feudalism, folks. That's dominance at the top. The second is that the income disparity has become so great, and the drive for growth has become so great. There's a lot of good things within capitalism, but that income disparity has become such that the middle class is struggling. And the current capitalistic model of growth and kill and growth is potentially not the model that will serve us in the future. We need to find better ways. So that's my view on capitalism. I think it's going to change. I think our views and our values are going to change. We'll be a purpose-driven future. So in the past, we were looking at markets and capital. In the future, we'll look at trust and social capital and a massive transformative purpose-driven things on sustainability, etc., to be able to define us. Another question was, would you assess the role of the World Health Organization and United Nations, especially in the backdrop of COVID? Folks, this is all we have. And these are institutions which were designed, as I said earlier on in the session, and Mark agreed, they were designed for the post-Second World War situation. And 75, 80 years later, they are living in the same sort of heavy hierarchical structure. We need much flatter organization, much more global, much more trust-based, much more connected. We need to have those kinds of infrastructures for United Nations and the World Health Organization. Now, who is doing a lot of good work, and we should give credit to them. UNDP is doing work. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals is a good goal. But the organization is heavy, and it needs to be restructured. And I think this COVID crisis is going to come up with some many new ways of how to actually get there. So Feroz Sanaullah, a friend of mine, he said, let me be a contrarian here. From the ashes of 2019 pandemic came the roaring 20s, an era of unprecedented growth prior to the next war. Would you not think we will revert back to a similar curve given the fundamental forces of intimacy, curiosity, emotional well-being are truly entrenched in human nature, and we will go back to the new work, bigger, better, and larger? Feroz, you are totally not being a contrarian. You're being exactly what I'm saying, is that there will be the roaring 20s, and the roaring 20s will roar with the 5G work, with the new healthcare, with solar energy, and within this whole environment of compassion and humanity. And that's where I sit. And that is what gets me up in the morning, and to go out there and engage with people and say, because I actually just believe in that. So it's not being contrarian, it's actually being very, very real. And this is, I think, our world in the future. So I think it's a great world. So I think we've had like Marx said, a little shock. It's like telling truth to a friend and telling them the hard truth. So it's showing some tough love. Perhaps this COVID crisis has just given us that jarring shock to really go and relook at that. So going back to my metaphor of the butterfly, that's the butterfly. The new butterfly will fly away and will find new wings. And the caterpillar, the fat caterpillars, by the way, get eaten up by birds and other insects. You should know that. So the caterpillar has to make that bold decision to go into the future. So thank you, Feroz, for that. Do you expect that energy will become free? This is from Ranjita. Do you expect that energy will become a free commodity in the future due to peer-to-peer exchange, and we might not need utility companies in total as next-gen smart utilities are on the rise? The answer is yes, in a short answer, but there will be different ways of providing energy and so on. But the big abundance question and creation of abundance is going to be the basis of solar energy and other forms of energy. So most oil companies are now going deep into their conversations, into the organizations, and saying, how do they literally metamorphose themselves into an energy company 10 to 15 years faster than they had intended? Now, will combustible energy go away? No, I don't think so. But if it was available there for the next 20 to 25 years, that's probably halved. And I think a lot of new things are going to come. Unemployment. If people are consuming less, producing less, traveling less, Deepak Jain asked about unemployment. I think it's a great question. I think the world is going through a reset, and this question perhaps I wasn't able to ask sufficiently deeply to Mark earlier on, and perhaps it's for the next time, is what happens to the future of work? What happens to the future of employment? Now, for the very first time ever almost, we will have 200 to 300 million people unemployed by the end of this crisis. So that in itself is a problem. Then you top it up with the disruption that is coming in because of technology and so on. So these types of things are coming in, and employment is going to be a factor. So the question there was, what happens to the people who need jobs? What happens to the people who need to live? I think we'll just have to find new ways to do things, and a lot of collaborative work and a lot of social things will happen. So one of the key things to me within employment is talent. Talent globally will be distributed, but because of technology, because of connectivity, the world economy, and my thesis is, would potentially become the talent economy. So it doesn't matter whether you're sitting in Vietnam or Mongolia, and I was talking to some of the Harvard students yesterday, they were sitting in Nepal and Ecuador. They can be just as effective with all of the new technologies, and they will find new ways of creation. But as robots come in and start taking our jobs, and as a lot of those things come in, there needs to be some kind of a mechanism, some methodology, some kind of, I wouldn't like to use the word taxation, but some kind of a productivity sharing system where people will be looked after in a more of a welfare environment, at least as at the basic level, and then grow from there. How can we expect this global shift when it is a struggle to even shop plastic industry and consumption? I feel that these are things that change with time. Behavior and culture and psychology will click in, and necessity starts creating new things. I am working from home. We, as my team, Paul, Francesco, myself, and the rest of the team, we came together and we just pivoted. We changed like that. So I think one of the key things is mindset, and the other is to create some tool sets. So the mindset that we had was, well, this is what we have. These are the realities of the world, and we now need to change and move forward. I think we need to start working on mindsets much, much more than we ever did before. So one of the students asked me yesterday, is that, oh, if I had the money, if I could go to this university, if I could do this, then I would be successful in the future. Folks, there are too many ifs in there, and there are too many limiting beliefs in there, and there are too many things that are getting in the way of your thinking out there. So the idea is not, if we had this, then we could do that. No, this is what we have. This is the hand we've been dealt with. This is the crisis we're in. Now we move forward. And we always find a way of how to do that. And I think I have a great belief in humanity and the ingenuity and the creativity of human beings to be able to find new ways and find new solutions as we go forward. A very good question. A very good question, and that is, we've been talking a lot about what will be different, but also the question was, what will remain the same? Folks, humanity will remain the same. Compassion will remain the same. Empathy will remain the same. Trust, all of these elements that are us as human beings will remain the same. We'll just need more of them. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that as we were discussing with Mark, about 20-25% of the companies, and he was pretty brutal by saying, yeah, they had weak balance sheets, they were living on 2 weeks of cash flow, and then basically they should, they have a bad model. So either they change or they go away. So there will be a lot of companies closing down, and we can't keep them up. But what will remain the same are the robust companies. They will find ways to become stronger, leaner, more optimal, and so on, and build from there. And then the anti-fragile companies will grow. So the companies on the edges will grow. So creativity will always be there. We will find, as Feroz was saying earlier on, the roaring 20s. In these roaring 20s, there will be amazing opportunities for entrepreneurs. Right now is the best opportunity for entrepreneurs and startups. And the reason, and I know it sounds really weird, but actually, this is where the new startups will come out. Because one, there is need. Secondly, the immune system of the organizations and the governments and people in terms of, oh, we can't do this, we can't do that, has disappeared. So you can go and ask any question and you can suggest anything. This is probably the only time that you will ever be able to see this, this kind of flexibility and acceptance as we go forward. One last question I will answer, and then we'll look at closing. And this was on leadership and what kind of new leadership are we looking at? And I think this is a very critical question, and I'll answer this into two parts. One part is for executive search firms. It's for people who are hiring leaders and so on. That new leaders need to have 4 absolute pillars to be successful in the future. And the new CEO also needs to be a futurist. A futurist is comfortable with the future, comfortable with shocks to the system, comfortable with experimentation, comfortable with failure, and basically be able to take the future and make sense of it. And be comfortable when it's not making sense also. Right now, the true leaders that will come out are the ones who cannot make sense, but know that there is hope at the end of that. Those are futurists. Innovators, well, we know that we need to keep developing and become more innovative in what we do. The third area is technologists. So rather than just looking at technology on the surface, drill deeper, understand robotics, understand gaming, understand other elements, and understand how the genome sequence works, not to produce or research, but enough to be intelligent about asking the right questions. The future is about reframing questions and asking a completely new set of questions, as opposed to just, the same old questions, going forward. So leadership will require technology and understanding of technology at a much, much deeper level. And last one, very close to my heart, folks, and it's really, really important, that new leaders need to be humanitarian. They need to look at sustainability. They need to look at the planet health. They need to be looking at the future of work. They need, with compassion and empathy, they need to be looking at the future of governance, of trust, of ethics, of all of those elements. Those institutions need to start coming together. And be open-minded while this thing is going on. So those are the future leadership categories and leadership characteristics and attributes that we were looking at. And finally, the softer skills of compassion and connection and love and intuition and so on. These are so important. And as we go forward, this becomes critical. I was talking to a very famous gentleman, Rob Capillo. He's part of the Symphony Orchestra in New York and Boston and Cleveland and so on. And he talks about the future of listening. We actually hear a lot, but we don't listen enough. Hearing is a technical exchange, but listening is emotional and psychological. So what he talks about when he does is he uses an orchestra as a metaphor, and he uses how an orchestra is like a company, and how the leaders, the conductors of the orchestra is like a CEO. We need to listen better. We need to listen for new trends. We'll need to understand that. So look and talk to people from different industries. Be curious. Listen to the new things that are going on. So I think those are amongst some of the new things. So what Rob talks about is the future of listening and the infinite power of listening. And I'll be doing a full webinar with Rob next week to actually talk about that and use music. And we'll look at Beethoven and Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, where Beethoven, by the way, did you know that he was deaf and he produced these great symphonies? So imagine, how can you be deaf and produce music? Let me release a little secret to you. So the next 10 seconds, let's have a little bit of fun. In your mind, without making any noise, you start singing Happy Birthday. So let's do it together. Did everybody sing Happy Birthday without making sound? You could clearly hear it in your head, couldn't you? This is how Beethoven wrote his symphonies, because in our minds, we can actually hear it and it's actually clear. So on the surface, he was deaf and therefore he should be thrown away. But his weakness actually became a strength, so he was focused on that. And the Ninth Symphony was written on one simple requirement, and that is connection. He wanted connection because he felt outside. So this social isolation that we are in right now is actually a great time to listen to Beethoven's music, because it actually is built around connection. He was seeking connection. So it's very, very ironic that this is, it's 250th birth anniversary this year. So that was happening. Another example, there's a very famous book that was, it's called Iliad, written by Homer. And he talks about these beautiful things. Homer was blind. So he used to imagine it from his mind's eye. So you think from your mind's eye, and then you write the book, and he transcribed the book, and people wrote it down. So there are a lot of times where some of the greatest activities have happened in the world, where our biggest weaknesses actually became our biggest strengths and became our catalyst to be able to go forward. And I think that was one of the key things that we were there. So we still have most of the people there. So I'm wondering, I wish I had more feedback in terms of, shall I shut up or shall I go on? I'll do one or two more questions and then I will start closing up. There's questions on there. So we need more women as CEOs to bridge the 4 pillars. We absolutely need more women as CEOs, not just to bridge the 4 pillars, but to go beyond those 4 pillars in terms of some of the other natural skills and competencies that they actually have. But absolutely, diversity is important. Diversity of all kinds, diversity of thought, diversity of gender, diversity of age, and all of these diversities actually come together, and this hopefully builds a wonderful society for us in the future. So folks, I think I will start wrapping up. Thank you for all the questions that you threw out there. Thank you very much for joining us and participating in this session. I hope you found it useful and candid and open and hopefully engaging. My final message is that we will prevail. This will pass. This will be behind us. in the coming months or however long it takes. The ones that remain strong and focused into the future, focused on abundance, focused on creating something new, focused on working with your friends, family, and community with compassion. That social capital that I was talking about. We absolutely need that right now. Building connection and emotion and that sense of belonging together. We need to build trust networks and trust relationships. And finally, we need to come together in collective consciousness and collective intelligence and with our hearts, close to our hearts, and we connect with each other. And there's so much abundance out there. I know people think I'm on drugs right now. Where's the abundance? But the abundance is there. We just need to reach out and look for it, and we shall find it. So therefore, ladies and gentlemen, stay safe, stay happy, stay focused on the future, but use this time in the best possible way you can. Do things you've not done and plan for things you're going to do that you've never done before. And that would be my final message. And I just wish you well. God bless, take care, and hope to see you in a week. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.